The financial advisor's office smelled like leather and old money, the kind of place where people went to feel important about their wealth. I sat in the corner chair, the one positioned slightly behind my parents, watching them perform what I'd come to think of as their successful people routine. We've built quite a substantial portfolio over the years, my father was saying, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed his own press releases. Real estate, blue-chip stocks, some private equity. We're at about $180 million now, wouldn't you say, Catherine? My mother nodded, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the afternoon light. Give or take. We've been very disciplined investors. Thomas Morrison, the financial advisor, smiled professionally and tapped at his tablet. That's certainly impressive. And you're looking to consolidate your holdings for better management. Exactly, Dad said. We have accounts scattered across different firms. Time to bring everything under one roof, get a clearer picture of our position. Well, I appreciate you considering Morrison Wealth Management, Thomas said. We specialize in high-net-worth families like yours. Now, I'll need to review all your current holdings to provide a comprehensive strategy. Do you have documentation of your various accounts? Most of it, Dad said, pulling out a folder. Though some of the newer investments are managed by, what was that firm name, Catherine? Sterling Capital Advisors, Mom said. They handle our more aggressive growth portfolio. I shifted in my chair, saying nothing. Sterling Capital Advisors. The firm I'd founded 8 years ago under my legal name, Alexandra Sterling Chin. My parents knew me as Emma Chin, their disappointing daughter who couldn't hold down a real job. Thomas glanced at me briefly, the polite acknowledgement you give to someone's unimportant relative. And you are? Our daughter Emma, Mom said with that particular tone, loving but apologetic as if my presence required explanation. She's visiting for the weekend. Emma's more of a creative type, Dad added. Not really interested in financial matters. Are you, honey? Not particularly, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Dad turned back to Thomas. She can't even manage a budget. Unlike us, we've always been very strategic about money. Mom laughed, that tinkling sound she made at country club luncheons. Remember when she tried to start that photography business? Lost $10,000 in the first year. We finally had to sit her down and explain basic business concepts. It happens, Thomas said diplomatically. Not everyone has a head for numbers. I smiled and said nothing. The photography business had been a deliberate failure. An easy cover story for why I was broke, while actually building a $340 million investment portfolio. The $10,000 loss was calculated to the dollar, designed to reinforce my family's belief that I was financially incompetent. The truth was simpler and more complex. I'd never been bad with money. I'd been phenomenal with it. But I'd learned early that my family couldn't handle that truth. When I was 22, fresh out of college with a finance degree, I tried to discuss investment strategies with my father at dinner. He'd laughed, patted my hand and said, "Leave the grown-up money talk to people who understand it, sweetheart." My mother had suggested I focus on finding a nice husband, instead of worrying about complicated things like stocks. So I'd stopped trying to prove myself to them. Instead, I'd quietly taken my $50,000 inheritance from my grandmother, the only person who'd believed in me, and turned it into something extraordinary. 8 years later, I managed over $340 million through Sterling Capital Advisors. My clients included tech executives, old money families, and several Fortune 500 CEOs. I specialized in aggressive growth strategies, particularly in emerging markets and undervalued tech sectors. My average annual return was 23%, consistently outperforming the market. What my parents didn't know, what they couldn't conceive of, was that 95% of their $180 million portfolio was actually mine. I'd been managing their money for 6 years through a complex web of shell companies and investment vehicles. They thought they were brilliant investors. In reality, every successful trade, every well-timed purchase, every profitable exit had been my work. Let's review your current positions, Thomas was saying, pulling up documents on his screen. I see significant holdings in Sterling Capital Advisors. That's a respected firm. Do you work directly with them? We do, Dad said proudly. They've been incredible. 28% returns last year alone. I'd personally executed every trade that generated those returns. My parents had no idea. I also see real estate investments in Prague, Singapore, and Austin, Thomas continued. That's sophisticated geographic diversification. We've always believed in global opportunities, Mom said, as if she'd personally selected those markets instead of signing documents I'd prepared and explained as routine investment updates. The Prague property was a residential complex I'd identified 3 years ago, buying at the bottom of a market correction. It had tripled in value. The Singapore holdings were tech sector investments that had generated $4.2 million in returns. The Austin properties were positioned perfectly for the tech boom migration. None of it was their insight. All of it was mine. There's also a significant position in Chin Medical Technologies, Thomas noted. That's an interesting holding. They've been volatile but trending upward. A family investment, Dad said. We wanted to support innovation in healthcare. What he didn't know was that I'd founded Chin Medical Technologies 4 years ago, using my Chinese surname to maintain separation from the Chin he associated with his surname. The company was developing AI-assisted diagnostic tools and was currently valued at $87 million. My parents held shares worth $12 million, purchased through their investment accounts with money I'd generated from their other holdings. They owned a piece of my company and had no idea I was the CEO. Very impressive portfolio, Thomas said. You've clearly made some sophisticated decisions. Experience matters, Dad said. We've been investing for 30 years. Actually, they'd been losing money for 30 years until I took over their accounts 6 years ago. Before I'd quietly assumed control, they'd been hemorrhaging cash on poor stock picks and emotional investment decisions. My father loved hot tips from golf buddies. My mother invested based on which companies had stores she liked. When I'd first gained access to their accounts, they'd asked me to help organize their paperwork. After a particularly bad quarter, I'd been horrified. They were 3 years away from retirement with $800,000 in losses from the previous 5 years. At their current trajectory, they'd have been financially unstable within a decade. So I'd fixed it, quietly. I'd restructured their entire portfolio, moved everything into vehicles I controlled, and spent 6 years rebuilding their wealth. I'd turned their near disaster into $180 million in managed assets, all while they congratulated themselves on their financial acumen and reminded me that I just wasn't good with numbers. Now, Emma, Thomas said, turning to me with the kind smile adults give to children at grown-up events. Do you have any retirement savings we should factor in? An IRA perhaps? Even small amounts matter. Nothing significant, I said. See. Dad laughed. That's what happens when you don't prioritize financial planning. Emma here thinks she can just wing it through life. We keep telling her to start saving, but... He shrugged as if my financial incompetence was a lovable quirk. My phone buzzed in my purse. I glanced at it. Urgent call from Sterling Capital. Excuse me, I said, standing. I need to take this. Of course, honey, Mom said. Take your time. The adults will handle the complicated stuff. I stepped into the hallway and answered. This is Alexandra. Miss Sterling Chin. It was James Park, my operations manager. We have a situation. The Morrison due diligence request came through. They're asking for full transparency on the Chin family portfolio holdings. My stomach tightened. Define full transparency. They want to know the beneficial ownership structure of all vehicles. If we comply with standard disclosure, they'll see that Sterling Capital Advisors, meaning you, controls 95% of the portfolio assets. The shell companies will be visible. When do they need the information? Standard due diligence timeline. 72 hours. I leaned against the wall, thinking rapidly. For 6 years I'd maintained this arrangement because my parents had never questioned their success. They'd simply assumed they were brilliant investors. Moving to Morrison Wealth Management meant external scrutiny, professional analysis, and inevitable discovery. What are my options? I asked. You could transfer everything back to their direct control before disclosure, but that would trigger massive tax events and likely alert them that something changed. You could refuse to provide the information, but Morrison would walk away and they'd wonder why. Or you could let them find out. Through the glass wall of Thomas's office, I could see my parents laughing, probably sharing another story about my financial incompetence. Dad was gesturing animatedly, Mom nodding along. They looked so happy, so confident in their narrative. Miss Sterling Chin? I need to think about this. Give me until tomorrow morning. Understood. But Alexandra? They're going to find out eventually. Morrison's good at his job. Even if you stall this time, any competent financial advisor will spot the ownership structure within weeks. I ended the call and stood in the hallway for a long moment. 6 years of work. 6 years of quietly saving my parents from financial disaster while they patronized me. 6 years of letting them believe they'd succeeded on their own. And now it was ending. I walked back into the office. Thomas was showing my parents a presentation about Morrison Wealth Management Services. Historical returns, client testimonials, fee structures. Everything okay? Mom asked when I sat down. Fine, I said. Work stuff. Oh, you have a job right now? Dad asked, surprised. That's good. What is it? Consulting, I said vaguely, the cover story I'd used for years. Well, that's something, he said, turning back to Thomas. So, what's the next step in consolidating our accounts? I'll need about a week to do comprehensive due diligence on your current holdings, Thomas said. Standard procedure for portfolios of this size. I'll review the ownership structures, fee arrangements, performance history, everything needed to provide you with optimal advice. That sounds thorough, Mom said approvingly. I pride myself on thoroughness, Thomas replied. Especially with complex portfolios like yours. I noticed several of your holdings are structured through what appear to be private investment vehicles. That's sophisticated estate planning, but I'll need to understand the full structure to advise you properly. Dad waved his hand dismissively. Our advisors at Sterling Capital set all that up. Tax efficiency, estate planning, that kind of thing. We just sign where they tell us to sign. Smart to trust the professionals, Thomas said. Though I do like to understand exactly who controls what, especially with multi-generational wealth. Do you have children other than Emma who might be involved in the estate planning? No, just Emma, Mom said. Though we've structured things so the money goes to various charities if she can't manage it responsibly. We love her, of course, but... She trailed off diplomatically. You don't want to enable poor financial habits, Thomas finished. I understand completely. They were talking about disinheriting me, while sitting on $180 million I generated, because they thought I couldn't handle money. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger exactly. More like clarity. Actually, I said quietly, there's something you should know about the portfolio structure. 3 pairs of eyes turned to me, my parents indulgent, Thomas's politely curious. The ownership structure is somewhat unique, I continued. Most of the holdings aren't actually in your names directly. Well, no, Dad said patiently as if explaining to a child. That's how sophisticated investing works, honey. Trusts, LLCs, investment vehicles. It's for tax purposes. Nothing for you to worry about. I'm not worried, I said. I'm just clarifying. The beneficial ownership of approximately 95% of your portfolio assets is actually held by Sterling Capital Advisors. Thomas's eyes sharpened. That's unusual. Typically, investment firms have discretionary authority but not beneficial ownership. That would mean that they own the assets, not us? Mom laughed. No, Emma, you're confused. We own the assets. Sterling just manages them. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, Sterling Capital owns the assets. Through a series of investment vehicles and trusts established over the past 6 years. The structure is complex, but the bottom line is clear. Sterling Capital controls 95% of what you think of as your portfolio. Dad's smile was fading. That can't be right. We have statements. Account documentation. You have statements showing returns on investments managed by Sterling Capital Advisors. I agreed. But if you look at the fine print, which I'm guessing you never did, you'll see that the actual ownership structure is more complicated. Thomas was scrolling through his tablet rapidly. Ms. Chin, are you saying your parents don't actually own? They own 5%, I said. Approximately $9 million in direct holdings. The remaining $171 million is owned by Sterling Capital Investment Vehicles, with your parents listed as beneficial interest holders, subject to various conditions. The room went very quiet. Emma, Mom said carefully, I don't think you understand what you're talking about. I understand perfectly, I said. I structured the entire arrangement 6 years ago. Dad laughed, but it sounded forced. Sweetheart, you can barely balance a checkbook. You didn't structure $180 million in investments. I unlocked my phone and pulled up my email, turning it so they could see the screen. This is my work email. Alexandra Sterling Chin, founder and CEO, Sterling Capital Advisors. Mom leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Then her face went pale. You're making a joke, she said weakly. No joke, I said. I swiped to another screen. My company's website with my professional photo and bio. I founded Sterling Capital 8 years ago. We manage $340 million in assets for 73 clients. 2 of those clients are Catherine and Robert Chin, though they were added to our roster 6 years ago without their explicit knowledge. Thomas was staring at his tablet, his professional composure cracking. Holy shit. You're Alexandra Sterling Chin? You gave the keynote at the Institutional Investor Conference last year. Your aggressive growth strategy paper was revolutionary. Thank you, I said. Dad's face had gone from confused to red. This is insane. You're saying you've been managing our money? That's not possible. We make the investment decisions. Do you? I asked calmly. Tell me about the Prague real estate acquisition. Why did you choose that market? He opened his mouth then closed it. Sterling recommended it. Which property specifically did you buy? Silence. What about the Singapore tech investments? Which companies? What was your thesis? More silence. The Austin properties. The Chin Medical Technologies position? The emerging markets bond portfolio. Mom's voice was barely a whisper. You're saying none of it was us? 6 years ago you asked me to help organize your paperwork after a bad quarter, I said. Remember? You'd lost $60,000 in 3 months on stock tips from Dad's golf buddies. You were frustrated, overwhelmed, and you asked your financially incompetent daughter to at least sort your documents so you could find things. I remember, Dad said slowly. I sorted your documents, and I saw everything. 25 years of investing that had netted you exactly $800,000. Which sounds impressive until you realize you'd actually contributed $1.6 million over that period. You'd lost half your invested capital through fees, poor decisions, and emotional trading. That's not, Mom started. I have the records, I said. Every trade, every loss, every fee. You were 3 years from retirement with barely enough to maintain your lifestyle. At your burn rate, you'd have been in trouble within a decade. Thomas was still staring at his tablet. The returns on this portfolio are extraordinary. 28% last year, 31% the year before. This is institutional-grade performance. Thank you, I said. I work hard for my clients. Your clients, Dad repeated hollowly. Were your clients? For 6 years, I confirmed. I restructured everything. Moved your assets into vehicles I controlled, executed a complete portfolio overhaul and rebuilt your wealth. That $180 million you're so proud of? 6 years ago you had $2.1 million in total assets. I turned it into $180 million. The silence stretched out, broken only by the hum of the office air conditioning. Finally Mom spoke, her voice shaking. Why would you do that? If you're so financially brilliant, why help us at all? Why not just let us fail? Because you're my parents, I said simply. And despite everything, despite years of being told I'm bad with money, despite being patronized and dismissed and treated like a financial idiot, I didn't want you to lose everything. So I fixed it. Quietly. But you let us think we did it, Dad said. You let us take credit. Would you have accepted help from me? I asked. If I'd told you 6 years ago that I wanted to manage your portfolio, would you have agreed? Would you have trusted your creative-type daughter who couldn't even manage a budget? Neither of them answered. I did what I had to do to help you, I said. I built wealth you couldn't have generated on your own, protected you from your own worst investment instincts, and turned a modest retirement into genuine financial security. And I did it all while you reminded me constantly how bad I was with money. Thomas cleared his throat. I'm not sure where this leaves us regarding the wealth management transition. It leaves you without clients, I said. Because if my parents want to transfer their assets to Morrison Wealth Management, they'll need to request that transfer from Sterling Capital Advisors. As the beneficial owner of 95% of their portfolio, I'd need to approve any such move. Dad's face went from red to purple. You're saying you could refuse? You could keep our money. Legally? Within the structure I created? Yes, I said. Practically. I'm not going to steal from my parents, but I am going to require them to make some decisions. What decisions? Mom asked warily. I pulled up another document on my phone and slid it across the table to Thomas. This is a proposal I prepared this morning when I heard about this meeting. Option 1. Your parents acknowledge my role as their investment advisor, we restructure the accounts to reflect transparent ownership, and I continue managing their portfolio under standard fiduciary terms. Their $180 million remains intact and continues to grow. And option 2? Thomas asked, scrolling through the document. Option 2. I liquidate all positions held in Sterling Capital vehicles on behalf of Robert and Catherine Chin, realize all capital gains and transfer the after-tax proceeds, approximately $112 million after federal and state taxes, directly to their control. They're free to invest with Morrison or anyone else they choose. Mom's eyes went wide. $112 million? What about the other $68 million? Taxes, I said. Capital gains on 6 years of extraordinary returns. If you want immediate control and to sever our professional relationship, that's the cost. Dad was doing math in his head, his face getting progressively angrier. You're saying we'd lose $68 million just to get away from you? You'd lose $68 million in taxes to regain direct control of your assets and work with a different advisor, I corrected. Or you could acknowledge that your financially incompetent daughter is actually one of the top wealth managers in the country and continue benefiting from my work. Thomas let out a low whistle. Miss Sterlington, this is. I've never seen anything quite like this. Neither have I admitted. But here we are. Mom's hands were shaking. How could you do this to us? How could you lie for 6 years? I didn't lie, I said. I just didn't correct your assumptions. Every time you congratulated yourselves on brilliant investments, I stayed quiet. Every time you dismissed my financial intelligence, I let you. Every time you told people I was bad with money, I smiled and changed the subject. I managed your portfolio in silence while you took credit for success you didn't earn. But we trusted Sterling Capital. Dad said. We thought. You thought you were working with strangers who respected your financial acumen, I finished. You never asked questions. You just signed documents and cashed checks and told people how smart you were. This has to be illegal, Dad said desperately. There must be laws against this kind of deception. Thomas shook his head. Actually, from what I'm reading in this documentation, it's entirely legal. Sterling Capital Advisors is a properly licensed investment firm. Ms. Sterlington has all required certifications. The ownership structure is complex but legitimate. And there's documentation here showing that you both signed agreements authorizing Sterling Capital to make investment decisions on your behalf. We signed those papers 6 years ago, Mom protested. Under advice from our financial advisor, Dad added. Your financial advisor being Emma. Thomas said quietly. Who is Alexandra Sterlington? My phone buzzed. James again. Morrison's office just requested full ownership disclosure. They're moving faster than normal. Your call? I looked at my parents, at their shocked faces, their anger, their confusion. For 6 years I'd protected them while they'd diminished me. I'd made them wealthy while they'd called me incompetent. I'd secured their future while they'd planned to disinherit me for my supposed financial irresponsibility. I need to make a phone call, I said, standing. Take some time to discuss your options. Thomas can explain the legal and financial implications of both scenarios. I'll be back in 10 minutes. I walked into the hallway and called James. They found out, I said. I gathered. What do you want to do? Prepare option 2 documentation. Full liquidation of the Chin portfolio, minus the 5% they own directly. Structure it to minimize tax impact where possible, but prepare for a full exit. Are you sure? That's a lot of capital gains. I'm sure. They wanted to consolidate with Morrison? Let them. But they'll do it with the assets I can legally transfer, not the structure I built. This is going to cost them nearly $70 million. It's going to cost them exactly what their pride is worth, I said. Send me the final documentation within the hour. I ended the call and stood in the hallway, watching through the glass as my parents argued with each other, their voices rising. Thomas sat between them, occasionally interjecting what I assumed were legal and financial realities. My phone buzzed with incoming emails. The liquidation documents, already being prepared by my team. Account closures. Position sales. Capital gains calculations. Everything needed to unwind 6 years of work in 72 hours. When I walked back into the office, my parents looked up at me like I was a stranger. We need to talk about this, Mom said. This is all happening too fast. We need time to. You have until 5 p.m. today, I said, placing a document on the table. This is option 2, fully detailed. If you sign it, I'll begin liquidation tomorrow morning. Within 30 days, you'll have approximately $112 million in liquid assets, after taxes free and clear. You can invest it however you want with whoever you want. And if we don't sign? Dad asked. Then we move to option 1. I remain your investment advisor under transparent terms. You acknowledge my role and we continue building wealth together. But the dismissiveness ends. The she's bad with money stories end. You treat me as the professional I am or we're done. Thomas cleared his throat. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I should note that Ms. Sterling Chen's offer is remarkably generous. She could legally make this transition much more difficult. The structure she's created gives her significant control. Control she obtained through deception, Dad said bitterly. Through omission, I corrected. I never lied about my credentials. He never asked. I never claimed to be incompetent. You assumed. The only deception was allowing you to continue believing what you wanted to believe about me. Mom's eyes filled with tears. How are we supposed to trust you now? Trust me. I laughed, the sound harsher than I intended. Mom, I've been trustworthy for 6 years. I've grown your wealth by 8,400%. I've protected you from every market downturn, every bad decision, every expensive mistake. I've been the most trustworthy person in your financial life, and you never knew it because you were too busy telling people I couldn't manage money. But you lied about who you were. I used a professional name, Alexandra Sterling Chen. Sterling from my middle name, Chen from our family name. It's not a lie. It's a professional identity. Plenty of people use different names professionally. Thomas was reading through the liquidation documents. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I strongly advise you to take the rest of the day to consider this. Both options have significant implications. What would you do? Dad asked him directly. Thomas hesitated. Professionally, I'd advise option 1. Your daughter has generated extraordinary returns. Her reputation in the industry is sterling. No pun intended. Walking away costs you $68 million and loses you access to one of the best wealth managers I've ever encountered. And personally? Mom pressed. Personally. Thomas looked at me then back at my parents. I'd ask myself whether my pride is worth $68 million and whether I can learn to see my child for who they actually are instead of who I assumed they were. The office fell silent again. 5 p.m., I repeated. Let me know your decision. I walked out, leaving them with Thomas and the documents and the weight of 6 years of misconceptions crashing down around them. At 4:47 p.m. my phone rang. Emma, she said. Her voice sounded worn, exhausted. Or should I say Alexandra? Emma is fine, I said. It's still my name. We've been talking. All afternoon. With Thomas with each other. Your father called our lawyer. And? We're not signing the liquidation document. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. Okay. But we have conditions, she continued. We want transparency from here forward. Monthly meetings to review portfolio decisions. And we want to understand how you did this. Really understand it, not just nod along pretending we get it. I can do that. Your father wants an apology. I laughed. For what? For saving you from financial disaster? For generating returns you could never have achieved alone. For lying, Mom said. For deceiving us. No, I said flatly. I'm not apologizing for protecting myself while helping you. If Dad wants an apology, he should probably start with all the times he dismissed my intelligence, patronized my capabilities, and told people I was bad with money. When I get that apology, I'll consider reciprocating. Silence on the line. I'll take that as my father not agreeing to those terms, I said. Emma. I'm serious, Mom. I'm willing to work together going forward. I'm willing to be transparent. I'm willing to help you understand the work I've done. But I'm not apologizing for being good at something you told me I was bad at. I'm not sorry for succeeding quietly while you failed loudly. More silence. Then, your father says we'll table the apology discussion. Smart choice. Send me a signed copy of option 1 by end of business tomorrow. We'll schedule our first official portfolio review meeting for next week. Emma, one more thing. Yes. Thomas said something that's been bothering me. He said you gave a keynote speech at some conference last year. About investment strategies. The Institutional Investor Conference, I confirmed. My speech was on aggressive growth in emerging markets. Were we there? Did we know? I closed my eyes, remembering. You were there. Dad dragged you to it because one of his golf buddies had a booth. You sat in the back during my keynote. Afterwards at lunch you asked me what I thought of that woman's speech. I told you I thought she made some interesting points. You said she seemed awfully confident for someone so young. Mom's breath caught. That was you. That was you on stage. That was me on stage talking about portfolio theory to 1,200 investment professionals while my parents sat in the back and didn't recognize their own daughter because she was wearing professional clothes and speaking with authority. Oh, Emma. It's fine, I said, and I meant it. You saw what you expected to see. You always have. After we ended the call, I sat in my office watching the sun set over Manhattan. My phone buzzed with the signed documents. Option 1 accepted. My parents choosing to continue working with me, even if they didn't fully understand what that meant yet. James knocked on my open door. The Chin family staying? They're staying. Good. Your returns on that portfolio are some of your best work. Would have been a shame to liquidate. It would have been a shame, I agreed. But I'd have done it. Because of pride? Because of principle, I corrected. I'll accept being underestimated. I won't accept being dismissed. There's a difference. He nodded and left me alone with the Manhattan skyline in my thoughts. Tomorrow I'd call my parents. We'd schedule that portfolio review meeting. We'd start the slow, awkward process of rebuilding our relationship on honest terms. They'd start learning who I actually was instead of who they'd decided I was. But tonight I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. 6 years of quiet competence had finally been seen. The daughter they'd called financially incompetent had been revealed as the architect of their entire financial success. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic revelation or immediate consequences. Sometimes it's just being so good at what you do that eventually, inevitably, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And when that happens, watching people recalculate everything they thought they knew, that's worth more than any apology they could offer.